So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Jaipreet Virdi. Dr. Virdi is a historian of medicine, technology, and disability. Her research and teaching interests include the history of medicine, history of science, disability history, disability technologies, and material and visual culture studies. She received her PhD from the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology at the University of Toronto. Dr. Virdi is currently completing her first book, Hearing Happiness, Fakes, Frauds, and Fads in Deafness Cures, to be published by University of Chicago Press. This book rethinks how therapeutic negotiation and the influence of pseudo-medicine shaped what is meant to be a normal deaf citizen in American history. Her other projects include Objects of Disability, which is an online resource database of historical artifacts used by or crafted by Canadians with disabilities. And she's collaborating on a project to trace the historical roots of clinical audiology in Britain and the role of women scientists, called Instrumental Injustices, Women Scientists and the Politics of Deafness in Interwar Britain. Today, Dr. Virdi is sharing some of her exciting work, which I saw at University of Toronto, before they whisked her off to University of Delaware, and I said we have to bring her back to McMaster because this is so exciting. Her talk today is called Prosthetics and Personhood, Object Histories at the Intersection of Medicine and Disability. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jaipreet Virdi.
Okay, I'm not very good with microphone. You can hear me in the back? Okay, good. I'm very happy to be here. I want to thank Ellen for inviting me. I actually lived in Hamilton right before I was, as you said, whisked away to Delaware. So it's great to be back. I want to say two things before I begin about my project. The first part gives you an overview of what Objects of Disability is and what I've been working on for the past 2 years and how this is still kind of an ongoing project. And what I have done as an historian of medicine to learn from this project, learn about material culture and adapt it to other lines of historical analysis. So let's begin with the story of an artifact. A prosthetic arm with hands made out of cast iron and grip. Cast iron and steel with 5 points of grip secured with leather bands. This is an object that is currently housed in the Meaford Museum, which is in Northern Ontario, although another, more intricate version of it is part of the Grey Roos Museum collection. Now, what exactly are these hands as they are commonly referred to? They belong to a man named Andrew Garley, who was referred to as the man with the steel hands as he toured Southern Ontario and Northeastern United States with Ripley's Believe It or Not, and thrilling the crowd with his carnivalistic talent, which was lifting a 250-pound Ford engine block to show the feast of strength that these artificial arms were able to give him. Now, for Garley, this was a functional prosthetic, far more useful than the hospital version that he was given in 1886 at the age of 16 when a sawmill accident resulted in amputation of both of his hands. And these arms were Garley's own creation, designed to fit the contours of his forearm and crafted with the assistance of his blind father. So Garley and his father worked together to design a type of prosthetic that better met his needs as a young man who wanted to be self-sufficient. He used these arms to build toys out of recycled parts for local children in Meaford to teach himself how to write and how to use utensils for eating. It was used for fixing bicycles because Garley had his own shop in which he fixed bicycle repairs. In his hometown of Meaford, Ontario, Garley's story is quite legendary and was even celebrated in 2014 when the town mayor wrote and then produced a play based on his own childhood memories of Garley's life. Now, Andrew Garley's life is a remarkable story of a young boy who was mercilessly mauled, a patriot working at a war munitions factory, a creative mind carving out new inventions, and of a very popular neighbor in France. It is also the story of a man whose prosthetic arm often overshadowed his own identity. In one interview, he expressed, "You don't realize what wonderful instruments your hands are. When you think of the things your hands can do, you never come to an end." These are very sweet words, but we see another perspective in the case of this autograph. The thing that goes the furthest toward making life worthwhile, that costs the least and does the most, is just a pleasant smile. And it is signed, written, by my steel hand. The words are written by my steel hand before they're actually signed by Andrew Gurley's own name. And it tells us something about how he perceived his own identity with his artifact. And the separation of sorts between the man and the prosthetic, but yet the two also remain adjoined, creating some kind of dependence, almost a symbiotic bond between user and object. And for Gurley, the creation of his outfitted, visible identity, so being independent, being self-sufficient, being a maker, all of this and his designing, crafting, and making of his steel hand serve to materialize their identity. I mean, they're not normal-looking hands in any way, based on their appearance, but in their use, they become something quite prominent, something useful, something embedded with meaning only by Gurley's own assistance, by his own physical encounters with the world. His identity, in other words, is designed through the material, welded through the steel hand to reconfigure not just physical interaction with the world, but also expectations about disabled bodies and what people with disabilities can do. From Gurley's story and the archival record of his life, we see more assuredly that people with disabilities were, quote, too busy living to be restrained by a post-structuralist worry over the cultural contingencies of what they did and who they were, as historian Catherine Ott has written. From the steel hand, however, we perceive the centrality of disability experience within history, the physical manifestation of human endeavor that we can use to mirror larger historical patterns. The hand, the prosthetics, are tangible evidence of one man's lived experience with disability. And we see this with the rough shaping of the curved grips, the tighter straps, and the softening of worn leather from youth. And they tell us something about the materiality of disability, perhaps if not in Gurley's case, and certainly in others, sometimes serving as the only remaining evidence of one person's lived experience. Now, disability is certainly unique to the extent which it is bonded with technology, tools, and machines as the medium of social interaction. We can learn a lot about the diverse lives of people with disabilities by looking at how they used, how they interacted with, and how they created all these technologies and their accessories. And these same technologies also define and shape the meaning of what disabled and able mean for these people. It also tells us about these relationships between innovation and commercialization, and between supply and demand. And as scholars of material culture know too well, object biography, especially of neglected artifacts, can dictate patterns in larger historical trends. So 17 years ago, Catherine Ott, David Sterling, and Stephen Mims were all historians of medicine and disability. They produced this book called Artificial Parts, Practical Lives. And the book includes chapters showing how disabled users were far more willing participants in prosthetic industries than had previously been uncovered or examined in historical records. The users were and are involved in design and manufacturing stages, from giving feedback to engineers who were upgrading myoelectric limb, working with rehabilitation specialists, nudging their own design discourse, or even making their own personal adjustment to the prosthetic for a much more comfortable fit. Since then, there has been a steady increase on historical scholarship focusing on users and disability technologies within interstitial spaces among different disciplines. including Claire Jones' 2017 edited collection, Rethinking Modern Prosthesis, as well as this book that just came out yesterday by Beth Williamson, Accessible America, A History of Design, of Disability and Design. These are just a handful of work among many others that work from a close examination of what exactly does impairment mean as a historically changing category, and they all outline this necessity of moving away from a diagnostic-centric perspective of disability and away from this standard model that disability is a need to fix impairment. The focus instead is on the construction of disability identities and the nuances in shaping this kind of user narrative of disability experience through technologies. So all of these works look at users, but I wondered, what about the objects themselves? How can they tell us about the nature of disability and disability experience in history? So in 2015, I began a project called Objects of Disability. It originally began at Brock University. And this project aimed to centralize object narrative in material culture collections of disability artifacts, especially those that appear to be conspicuously absent in histories of material culture. I mean, prosthetics and assistive technologies always tend to garner curiosity. If you go on any best of list or unique instrument list on the interweb, prosthetics are among the top 10. But only one aspect of the lived experience of disability, albeit one that is clearly intricately tied to a medical framework. But what about rehabilitation therapy tool or occupational therapy art? What about adjustments that are made for customization for women or for children? What about objects of mental health? What do they look like? Or crafted homemade devices rather than commercialized ones? What about self-representation in design, personal adaptation, or even art? Where do these objects fit in how we think about disability? And the consideration of these objects would certainly describe a richer, more complex story of disability. And what I want to do with this project was bring forth these invincible collections within museums, libraries, and archives, and highlight object narratives that were not considered relevant, that were ignored, or were just kind of forgotten. And I've worked with over 40, 50 institutions, and now the project is with me in Delaware, and it's still kind of ongoing in the northeastern United States and bring it back to Ontario. And I built a database of up to 500 artifacts and representations of people using these objects of disability. And there are things from invalid cups, different kinds of prostheses, there's indigenous artworks on snowshoes, and there's also various 20th century crafted devices, occupational therapy art, and personalized adjustment to commercialized products. Now, one thing I've learned from this project is that when we look at these kinds of artifacts, we can actually learn a lot about the range of medical problems that led people to purchase or make these objects. We can see the prevalence of illness, injury, dismemberment that requires solutions to rehabilitate and configure the body to a sense of normality that was often defined by the disabled person's own experience with the world. And this normality emphasizes how body reconfiguration as time was sometimes perceived as a necessary step for asserting labor and ability to work, as well as for attaining citizenship or a sense of community belonging. However, consumer products did not always fit with disabled bodies or disabled people's expectations. So oftentimes, individuals prefer to design or modify their own technological devices. And in some instances, these objects no longer exist, but they do exist in representation. They exist in art, in photographs, they exist in letters, sometimes in catalogs. They exist in medical records. And when we look at these objects through their presence in different types of sources, and we look at their history, we can follow the expansion of stories to untangle and narrate multiple transnational intersections of disability. And what Objects of Disability have done as a project is help shape my thinking about how to look at object narratives, even within standard, well-known histories. So I'm going to focus now on one particular object of disability, the story of an ear trumpet, much like this one here. Ear trumpets and hearing aids fall under the category of prosthetics because they're used to deliver sound to what was once lost. And it connects that person to the world of sound, but they also create a kind of dependence. A user is cured or has normal hearing only when the aid is in use. When they stop using it, they are deaf or they are incurable again. Indeed, as historian David Turner explained, when such devices were increasingly advertised to the public, they were done so in ways to emphasize the value in restoring function and the appearance of normality. They were promoted as cure, even though they only work as cure when they are in use. Remember that. Okay? A person can say they are hard of hearing, or they can say that they are hearing when they're wearing hearing aids or using one of these ear trumpets. But when they stop using them, they are deaf once again. So hearing prosthetics fit in this really strange center between cures and non-cures. And at the same time, what these advertisements of ear trumpets tended to do is that they address this polite aspiration of users. Users were expected, if not maybe even demanded, to fulfill a sense of normality, a sense of behavior so that they can pass as a normal type of law-abiding citizen. But when the device is not in use, as I said, when it is placed on a lap, when it's put away in a drawer, maybe forgotten somewhere, the deafness is incurable again, and the normality dissipates. From the 18th century, all prosthetics, or aids to hearing, as they were often advertised, weren't initially designed to be conspicuous. Around 1800, however, the German manufacturer Frederick Charles Rain set up a shop in London, England, as an acoustic venture. And he sold hearing trumpets of various sizes and shapes, from 19-inch trumpet to pocket collapsible tube to banjo or dome style that were quite powerful for resonating sound. Later renamed F.C. Ryan and Son when his son became involved in the company, the business became the leading manufacturer and seller of hearing trumpets in England and North America before they closed shop in 1963. They designed new types of hearing prosthetics that were epitome of modernity, lending scope to craftsmanship by offering individualized fitting rather than mass-produced imitation. And they were known for devising acoustic aids that were meant to be hidden, concealed within the skin or the body, or disguised as furniture and ordinary objects, crafted to disappear when it was not in use. So things like urns, fan, headband, walking cane, bearded hearing aids, all meant to be hidden. And they were cleverly obscured ear trumpets that shifted the design trend towards invincibility and would later be adapted to the design of 20th century electric hearing aids. Yet no matter the size of the device or even its price, acoustic aids require the user to devote time and effort to ensure that the conversation could be intelligible without the awkwardness of lip reading or writing down what they were trying to say. Some users, as you can imagine, found the aids to be problematic. They could be bulky, they could be heavy, they were cumbersome, they were awkward, they didn't always work, they made other people uncomfortable when they were in use. People didn't like yelling into the ear trumpet. But they also serve as objects of pity and reminder of infirmity. You can't pretend you are not deaf when you are wearing one of these devices, no matter how well they're designed to be invincible. And for some users, these acoustic aids were actually painful to use and forged unhappy relationships between themselves and the prosthetic because they create a sense of shame and self-stigmatization, especially if they were denying their deafness. But then there were users who embraced their prosthetic as part of their identity, part of this inseparable, ingrained extension of their body without difficulty. They framed their devices as badges of pride, sometimes making accessories like the delicately woven and ornately beaded pouch for storing their hearing prosthetic and carrying it around when not in use. This one was made by a woman named Amelia Wood, who worked and lived in a farm just north of Ottawa. And what she would do is that she would tie her little pouch on her skirt so that when she was working and she needed to engage with her sister, she would take out this type of hearing aid called a conversation tube and have a conversation while in the farm. And then when she didn't need to use it, she put it away. So for some deaf users, their dependence on the acoustic aids enabled them to craft new identities that allowed them to control, if not define, the discourse surrounding their deafness. By merging prosthetics with their personhood, these users declined becoming passive recipients of a purposeful medical device, rather choosing to become active participants who evaluated, modified, and in some instances designed their own prosthetics. We can then view prosthetics as being culturally symbolic for a user's own quest for functional normalcy, something that allows them to be self-sufficient and independent and assert their autonomy, personhood, identity, and self-representation, even if it meant for them just passing the hearing. And this brings me now to the Honorable Dorothy Brett. One of the things I was looking at when I was collecting representation of objects of disability is I want to find photographs or painting or some kind of representation showing a person using the object. And I came across Dorothy Brett by looking at one painting, which is something I've never really seen before. And I'll show you the painting in a little while. But it's a woman carrying an ear trumpet. And what I thought was just an interesting self-representation took me down this little rabbit hole into Dorothy Brett's life, and this incredible story about a woman whose deafness was such a part of her identity that it was almost impossible to look at any of her other relationships without thinking about her deafness. And today I want to talk a little bit about what this meant for her and what that can tell us about the history of objects, the history of deafness and disability more broadly. Dorothy Brett was the daughter of Reginald Bailey Brett, who was the second Viscount etcher and a close advisor to Queen Victoria in England, and the daughter of Eleanor Van de Wire. And she spent the first 20 years of her life clustered under the powerful influence of her father. Born on November 10, 1883, in fashionable Mayfair, London, Dorothy was, from the beginning, a proud, haughty, and bad-tempered child. And her doll-like features, golden hair, luminous brown eyes, and pouty lips scarcely subdued her rebellious nature. And her family often referred to her as Doll, and she spent her childhood playing in the corridors of Windsor Castle with regular incursions into the Red Drawing Room for dancing lessons with the princess and the prince under the watchful eye of old Queen Victoria. January 22nd, 1901, Queen Victoria died at the age of 81. I didn't mean to rhyme, I'm sorry. A year after the funeral, during preparation for the coronation of Edward VII, which was actually organized by Escher, Dorothy's father, Dorothy felt severely ill with appendicitis, and the king sent over his personal physician, Sir Frederick Treves, who then announced that an immediate surgery was needed to remove Dorothy's appendix, which was infected and inflamed. And Treves insisted that without the surgery, the girl was going to die. The remainder of her life, Dorothy perceived appendicitis as a watershed moment. Not only should she barely survive the operation and spend weeks in a wheelchair during his convalescence, but not long after her illness, Edward VII also fell ill with appendicitis. In her unpublished memoirs, she wrote, "At the time, it was thought that perhaps my father had carried a germ from me to the king, so little was known of the disease at the time, and she felt some sense of responsibility in that it was her own doing that made the king sick." 2 days before the king's planned coronation, Therese performed the operation to save his life, despite great political pressure to postpone the surgery until after the coronation. For the remainder of her life, Dorothy viewed this incident not only causing a political crisis, but also for her gradual hearing loss, which she believed initially began with childhood trauma. "I think my deafness began with the desire to shut out the criticism and bullying of my brother, purely psychological. I simply desired to shut it all out." A few years later, in 1910, perhaps coincidentally, not long after King Edward's death, Dorothy decided to shed her secluded upbringing and enroll into the Slade School of Art in London. 1910 was also a banner year for modernist painting as well, with Roger Fry's exhibition of post-impressionism, leading Virginia Woolf to call it the year the world changed. And the world did change for Dorothy Brett. This was a transformative year in which she cut her hair in the bohemian style that was peculiar to slave students, what Woolf referred to as crop hat. And she started to slowly shed away her aristocratic upbringing and sever ties with her family. And in the tradition of the school, which called for students and staff to be known by their surname, Dorothy became Brett, a name she would go by for the remainder of her life, shedding her old identity and embracing a new one that she herself had created. Her circle of friends were of the artistic and literary elite at the time: Virginia Woolf, George Bernard Shaw, Lady Ottilie Morrell, Bertrand Russell, who some of you might know, being here in McMaster, Aldous Huxley, Catherine Mansfield, John Middleton Murray, Dora Carrington, Mark Gertler, and D.H. Lawrence, the famed members of the Bloomsbury group, some of whom are photographed here. It was during her Slade years when Brett's hearing significantly declined. While some of her classmates remember her using a fabric ear trumpet, most of them never recalled her using any kind of ear trumpet or any kind of assistive device. Indeed, faced with the realization that her deafness was worsening, it appears Brett did not initially accept her hearing loss, rather perceiving it as the temporary condition that could be treated, if not cured, with proper medical care. She wrote to her father describing her plan to see a specialist for a radium cure and to try something called Dr. Foster's miracle cure, which required to insert injections in her behind, even though we don't know what was in those injections, or often she had to inject herself, or even why it had to be applied in her behind. But it was one of those like patented crack cures that were available. Brett even planned a trip to the tropical area of the Star Walk with her sister Sylvia, hoping that she could return with my deafness cured, because I really don't see much use in being alive and stone deaf. By 1915, Brett frequently started to withdraw in her deafness, because it was the time that my deafness grew worse, and I felt that I was slowly being cut off of life. She was depressed and suicidal, finding herself hopelessly trapped between two worlds, one of inner security awakened by the realization that her deafness was a manifestation to protect herself against childhood trauma. The other, a longing to be involved with the vibrant and intellectual spirit of a circle of friends. She was of the squirrel type, Lady Ottilie recalled, and poor thing, very deaf. I liked her and I felt sorry for her, as her deafness made it difficult for her to be friends with people, and I knew her family were not kind or sympathetic to her. I felt she was a sort of Cinderella, and that I had to help her find new friends. And it was Lady Ottilie's encouraging and this need to participate in conversation that pushed Brett to step out of her inner security into the warmth of friendship. Not everyone, however, among her circle of friends was sympathetic to Brett's deafness. Bertrand Russell, for instance, would express his anger if she left to retreat in her deafness at the precise moment that he was going to read out loud from a book, and he would bully her to return and sit close to him so she could hear every single word as he was reading. When Russell was in prison before the end of the Great War, Brett wrote him a very long letter comparing her deafness to confinement, and the letter, which is actually kept here at the McMaster Archive. And this is part of her letter she describes. But you can imagine what it means to see life revolving around you, see people talking quite meaninglessly, like looking through a shop window or a restaurant window. It is also hideous. I sometimes wonder how I can go on. I think if it were not for my painting, I would end it all. Russell's reply was only half sympathetic. I believe there are things you can do that could make it less trying. Practice lip reading. Take care of your inner attitude to people. Let it not be satirical or aloof. Though your deafness may make that harder, it doesn't make it impossible. It will be around this time that Toby emerged. Toby was the flat-tin ear trumpet Brett relied upon for aiding in conversation, and she referred it to Toby. We don't know why she picked this name, but it had a name. Perhaps Toby was there years earlier, maybe even before Brett's years at Slade, and perhaps he was there among other different kinds of ear trumpet. But if he was there, he was completely hidden in a shadow. So none of these early photographs of Brett make any reference or show Toby, and he barely makes a peek in her hand in this one photo, dated from 1917. This is the photograph of Brett with art critic Clive Bell. And you can see Toby hidden, but he's there in her hand. And this is the earpiece, and clapped in her hand is the disc. Later, when Brett started to appear more confident, likely due to emerging status as an artist, Toby becomes present more and more, especially after 1818. Perhaps the war changed Brett's perception of mortality, because she did, after all, want to contribute to the war effort, but her father ridiculed her aspiration, especially after Brett decided that she wanted to be a chauffeur, seeing that as possibly the only job that she could do. And her father hotly criticized her for this. You still let all trades for yourself. A chauffeur, how are your poor ears ever going to hear the motor horn behind? You will have trumpets sticking out behind the motor. It's just as likely that as more and more soldiers return from the front with disability, the visibility of disabled experience in England could have lent some kind of confidence to Brett as well. In private correspondence, Toby is mentioned as part of Brett's self-created eccentric character. Sometimes he's mentioned as a description of her action, sometimes in ridicule. Yet as an object, Toby exists in representation and had a presence. And his absence, too, tells us a lot about Brett's introspective perception of herself. Because she was an artist, so we can learn a lot about what she was thinking, what she was feeling, by looking at her painting. So for example, the painting that she was the most proud of, Umbrellas, painted in 1917, it celebrates Lady Ottilie and a friend in her cottage, including John Middleton Murray in the back with his wife Catherine Mansfield, Lady Ottilie seated here, her daughter Julian with her hand rested on Aldous Huxley, who's reading from a book, writer Lytton Strachey, and there is Brett over there. Toby is not here. But Brett painted herself with her head tilted. leaning forward. The kind of behavior we do when we're trying to listen very carefully. And she therefore was seated here amongst other people, listening to someone read from a book. She's perhaps straining to hear, trying to pass. And it's clear she's very proud of this painting. And Virginia Woolf described this one encounter when Brett showed her the painting in her studio. She is evident very proud of a great picture full of blue umbrellas, which seems to console her from being deaf. And again in another letter to Escher, we see how for Brett, painting was a kind of an escape. One thing. Sorry. One slide. She wrote in the letter, perhaps if you had been deaf at my age and realized that nearly all contact with the outside world was slowly receding from you, that you were practically dead among the living, you would understand the horror and the despair of such an existence and how in desperate endeavor to remain sane, you even might cling to your art as the only salvation. As you can imagine, I've scanned many, many photographs and paintings to find Toby. Where he appeared at a time there was some kind of changes in Brett's own personal life. But he appeared more notably in the 1920s after she had started to separate ties from her family and felt herself being more free when she was trying to separate herself from the friends that she felt she had no support from, the friends who were critical and constantly ridiculing her. He is here, more visible than before, in this 1920 painting of Brett by her friend Alvaro Guevara. We don't see the end piece anymore. We see the disc. We see the face, in other words, of Toby. And he appears here, much more clearly this time, in a 1921 photograph of Brett with Catherine Mansfield sitting in her lap. The two women swore an eternal pact of friendship and were so close they were rumored to be lesbians. The Mansfield empathized with Brett's deafness so severely, writing in a letter, "How deeply I feel for you in your deafness. Perhaps you think people accept it. Forget it. I never do, and I never could. I think you are wonderfully courageous to accept it as you do, and I am constantly realizing what it must mean to you." Toby wasn't Brett's only hearing companion at this time. Also, he was the one that she was the most intimate with. She did experiment with other kinds of acoustic devices, including a Marconi listening machine, which amplified external sound, and one of the earliest electric hearing aids that were available in the UK. But she was the most reliant on Toby. And he most assuredly makes an appearance in the 1925 self-portrait I mentioned. Here is Brett, wearing a dark cloth hat and a raincoat with the collar drawn up high. And she stands tall and fixes her gaze to the audience. One hand rests inside a pocket, and the other grips Toby. And we see Toby in his full reveal in a way we've never seen before. Now, no matter how well a deaf person carefully crafted social situation generated by the deafness, the ear trumpets were obvious markers of difference that evoked pity and even ridicule from the hearing counterpart. Some of Brett's friends complained about constantly having to, quote, yell down her ear trumpet, her Toby. Russell, for instance, expressed in a letter to Lady Ottilie after Brett's friendship with the woman fell apart. "I wonder whether you quite get Brett. I am sure her deafness is the main cause of all that you regret in her." In her unpublished memoirs and in some private correspondence, Brett expressed that despite the ridicule she faced, deafness daily brought on this excessive tiredness after so long watching people's mouths opening and closing and trying to listen. It was a drain on her energy and the cause of a lot of her emotional and mental stress. It's no wonder that she was completely beholden to Toby, that she was utterly devastated the day he was stolen. And this occurred in 1924, when she accepted D.H. Lawrence's invitation to join his utopian community that he created at a ranch at the Sangre de Cristo Mountain, just north of Taos, New Mexico. 14 years later, Brett would become an American citizen and spend the rest of her life on the ranch in Taos. Her life there and the relationship with Lawrence has been explored in depth by Lawrence scholars, but none have sufficiently explored how deafness was also part of that relationship. Brett herself describes the first meeting back in London when at a social gathering, she put her ear machine on a table right beside Brett, who then looked at it and laughed, a bit quizzically, making a few ribald remarks about the impossibility of making love into such a box. In another incident, this time back in New Mexico, Brett recalls having to call Lawrence to lunch. He had a habit of going away into this hill and leaning against a tree and spending the days writing his stories. And her job was to go call him for lunch to eat the meal that she had prepared. In one incident, he's again sitting against the tree deep in thought, and she claps to get his attention, which frightens him, and he gets angry. And over lunch, Lawrence asks her, why don't you just whistle instead? It's far less jarring than being broken out of thought by clap. And Brett realizes she doesn't whistle because she can't hear a whistle, and she automatically assumed that Lawrence couldn't do the same either. It's an interesting way of her to think about her space and relationship with other people, that sometimes she's manifesting her own deafness into others. But it was while touring Oaxaca, Mexico, with Lawrence and his wife Frida, that Brett realized, Toby is missing. My precious ear trumpet. I rush back to my room. I search everywhere. Not a sign. I am in despair. I am helpless. Lawrence was furious with the theft and demanded that the hotel manager where they were staying at to assist in the recovery, so they put notices of Toby's theft with a reward for his safe return all over the town square. Brett, however, was told that it was very unlikely that Toby would ever be found and returned. Anxious, Brett sketched out a drawing of Toby from memory and then took it to a local tinsmith, who she described as an intelligent Indian. Toby revived again until a clone had arrived from London, likely from FCNY. And now this collaborative enterprise, Brett sketching, the tinsmith crafting, and then the commercialized replacement, all reflective of how prosthetics were historically and culturally designed and negotiated by the user, often in contentious circumstances. What or who does Toby then become? Whether the tinsmith crafting of the replica that was drawn or designed by Brett, or the commercial version that was later shipped over, was Toby still Toby? For Brett, perhaps it was, because she still referred to her replaced ear trumpet as Toby, but not as frequently as she did before. And he was also perceived as much as a part of her identity as her artistic skill. Upon returning to the Taos ranch, Brett described the strange communication she had developed while listening to the silence around her, through Toby and without Toby. The silence around me was not the silence of deafness, in spite of my not hearing the flow of the water, the birds, and the animal call. One becomes aware of vibration, of a different, more subtle form of communication. Here, Brett's personification of the ear trumpet certainly speaks to how she was trying to maintain this polite appearance of normality within the confinement of a social group, but also something greater than that, something more natural and spirit that she was slowly starting to discover as she was engaging with the Pueblo people who lived near the reservation. Through Toby, she was effectively mediating her lived experiences with the identity that she had forged for herself in New Mexico and that she wanted the device to represent. After all, to stat for this photograph in 1933. Perhaps the most assertive we've ever seen her identify as a deaf woman reliant on an ear trumpet named Toby. Now this is the duplicate, the clone, but perhaps for Brad, it's the same embodied spirit in there. In Tao, it seemed that Brett came closer to a sense of identity than ever before. Her art, lavish painting of ceremony and ritual of the Pueblo people, merged the visionary world with a style that largely became her own. She continued using Toby, but her hearing appeared to have worsened at this time, just around the time that these new electric multi-pack vacuum tube hearing aids were appearing in the market in the late 1930s. In one letter titled Christmas Morning, Brett acknowledges that how even though she replaced Toby by these new electric hearing aids, the ridicule and the stigma against those still persisted. I am tiresome to my friends, but mostly to those who yell at me, until my instrument vibrates and buzzes like a beehive. It is a natural, insensitive thing to shout at the deaf, but when tuned in, I am no longer deaf. The hearing aid then became vital for Brett, and we see them more and more in her photograph. And she's seated here with artist Maple Dodge Lujan, D.H. Lawrence's wife Frida, and herself, and you see the hearing aid quite clearly in her hands. And like many other people who rely on their object of disabilities, on their prosthetics, the need to create or add something to connect the device to the self in a symbiotic way appears pivotal in how they start to accept their disability. In other words, the adaptations and design changes become reflective of the importance of personhood. After all, users often function as producers, modifying and redesigning inadequate objects of disability, often in response to frustration with certain features of the object, including functionality. Sometimes these modifications were necessary to shape the identity that the user wanted to represent for themselves, and sometimes to make them better. Brett, for instance, often took apart her Marconi earphone, which you can see here in the photo, in her hand, poking cautiously among all other kinds of spools and unhooking wires to make it more powerful. And she kept this 1940s hearing aid in a carved leather case, part of it which is obscured by her hand, but she decorated with pieces of Indian silver and turquoise that everybody recognized this creation. As artifacts of culture, the materiality of these objects highlights the varied way that disability can be redefined. It is more than a tool to fix it or normalize an impairment. It is an object for navigating, sometimes quite literally, and engaging with challenges of usability and adaptation while merging with the sense of self. In 1970, for example, when Brett's biographer, John Hicknett, went to Towers to meet her, he observed that she was still using a hearing aid resembling a scaled-down 1930s radio that she hung around her neck and kept it in her pocket, instead of the newer, more powerful hearing aids that were available at that time. And if you pay close attention in the painting I showed you earlier, the hat she's wearing in the photograph is the same one that's from the painting, again telling us a lot about how she wanted people to perceive her. Now, whether her decision to continue wearing a 1938 hearing aid in 1970 was a personal preference or economic necessity, what is certain that as Brett aged, she appeared to fully embrace her deafness. In this 1958 painting, titled Lawrence's Three Fates, Brett showed writer artist Maple Lujan, Frida Lawrence, and herself in a room with D.H. Lawrence seated under the pine tree. And gray-haired Brett is working at a typewriter because she often typed up Lawrence's handwritten manuscript. Toby is long gone and is replaced by an electric hearing aid that is clearly visible in her pocket. And as more writers and artists went to visit Brett in New Mexico, we see her in photographs again and again with the hearing aid clearly visible. And these two photographs are taken around the time that she started to go blind. And they tell us something about the history of multiple disabilities and the history of aging. The overlapping of category pushes us to think about how the meaning of things people use to craft identities for themselves often tend to also reflect some kind of healing that doesn't always fall under the parameters of conventional medicine. Brett started to go blind. Remember, she relied on her painting to make sense of her deafness. So what she started doing in her painting around this time is incorporate the notion of spirit or essence. A, a concept that was the root of her ceremonial painting, a reflection to a more naturalistic way of thinking. Brett never aspired to emulate the Pueblo or Navajo people who she captured on canvas, but she did learn from a healer named Ruby Corbett on how to become comfortable with her own spirituality to find some peace in her disability, especially later in her life when her worsening sight prevented her from painting. From the upper echelon of Victorian aristocracy to the rugged landscape of Taos, New Mexico, Brett always referred to this personal odyssey as a strange and beautiful journey. And we see the latest painting I found of her self-representation where she paints her face trapped in a crystal, struggling to reveal the hidden spirit. Now, by way of a conclusion, let me read a quote about hearing loss and prosthetics that I found in a catalog of surgical instruments. It always seems to us strange that people object to letting their friend know they are hard of hearing when the use of these simple devices would bring so much happiness to themselves. After all, if people were spectacle, without experiencing a feeling of difference, without feeling any sense of shame, why don't those needing hearing aids feel the same way? Why is it that when we talk of deafness, we tend to describe the loss of hearing as an isolating and tragic event that confines the person in unhappy silence? Why, as historian Graham Goodey and Karen Sawyer point out, why don't we refer to the blind or partially sighted as hard of seeing the way we refer to deaf people as hard of hearing? Perhaps the difference resides in the labor. For hearing aids generally do require far more skill, patience, and effort than the successful wearing of glasses. And perhaps the difference lies in the fact that hearing loss tends to be more stigmatized than blindness due to this close association people make between deafness and dumbness. But the way we pay attention to objects of disability and the way people use these objects affords a narrative shape historical experiences of not just disability but also impairment and aging. And I want us to perceive Burley's steel hand and Brett's Toby as an example of how objects of disability occupy intersectional, intertwined histories. By positioning these objects of disability as emissionaries of culture and personhood, we can also gain insight into histories that tend to be overlooked when they are well represented in standard narrative, varied personalized representation of disability. Thank you.
We can take some questions. Oops.
Hi.
So you mentioned that there was sort of this symbiotic bond between the user and the object, and then there was the sense of here versus non-here when they don't have the object. Did Dorothy Brett ever advocate for the sense that she didn't need to be here, that deafness was just like a natural part of her versus having a state which led her to a bit like normalcy, I guess?
So the question is about how Brett perceives the curing?
Yeah.
Okay, so how did Brett rely on prosthetics as a way to cure her deafness? Okay, that's a good question. So the thing with hearing prosthetics is that they occupy this fluid boundaries between how you were is cured. As long as you are wearing it, you're considered to be cured because what you're using it for is for deafness. When you're wearing it, you're hearing sound and you're not deaf. Brett early on believed a hearing aid was something that needed medicine to fix. So there's lots of documentation of her going to different types of ear specialists, find some kind of surgical, medical, crack medicine treatment. Realizing none of them would help her, she started to use an ear trumpet. For most of Toby's existence, it seemed that she had this conflicting identity because when she was using it, she was cured, and she called herself being cured as long as she was using it. But when he was lost, she was devastated. And it seemed like his loss also appeared in the same time that all these other electric hearing aids were appearing in the market, so she was chosen to select some of those. And she doesn't describe her electric hearing aid the way she described Toby. She talks about them more as an accessory, almost, that will allow her to work as someone who can communicate. But Toby is seeing what the prosthetic that she can use to precision what it meant to be cured. And I think it's really interesting because the hearing aid, the technology of hearing aids allowed her to hear much better than Toby ever could, but she never had that same relationship with them. And part of it could be that later in life she became more accepting of her own deafness and perhaps seeing it as something that she no longer needed to cure, but just manage, just deal with, or part of her own identity as a deaf person.
Here's the microphone.
Oh,
Is it under your clothes or?
Oh, it's right now.
We're not hearing it. It's not your.
Okay. How's that?
That's better.
That's better. Okay. Sorry. Yeah.
I was just going to ask if you could possibly speak a little bit more to maybe how, as we kind of moved on into the 21st century and stuff, mass production and with increased, I guess, like, just having more prosthetics and stuff probably created more technologically advanced and also just more groups, like how that's kind of affected people's connection or ability to kind of design or modify their own prosthetics?
Okay, good. That's a good question. So the more technologically advanced we make prosthetics, how do people have the chances to design or change them? Okay, I want us to think the most visible example, a prosthetic leg. Prosthetic legs, when they often are mass-produced, have a pinkish tinge to it. Okay, they're mass-produced in that way. How would a black woman deal with that? That's actually a case that happened in 2015, 14. The British National Health System, as you know, gives free prosthetics to a lot of people who need them. And there was this case of a black woman who had her leg amputated from bone cancer. And she was given a prosthetic leg that was pink. It did not work for her. And no matter what they did, they would not give her another leg. And she threatened to take the case to court. And it's a need to understand who the users are. Like, mass-produced production doesn't always work for everybody. Another instance you can think of is how some people who wear prosthetic legs paint them. They paint them blue. They draw flowers on them. They put shoes on them. So all of these are modifications that reflect personal style and personal tastes. Maybe the technology is so far advanced that we can actually take prosthetic legs apart and tinker with the electric contacts in there. Okay? The way that early 20th century users would often change like the bracelet or the leather on it. But they are ways that people are constantly adjusting the way. And it's not just the exterior. I also want you to think about the interior. When you change your padding inside to make it more comfortable, to better deal with the force of grip, to prevent infections or injuries, all of these are personal adaptations because the goal is to make this object more comfortable and more in line to your own body. Okay? Yes, good question. Yes?
So you talked at the beginning a bit about medical understandings of disability and fixing disabled people, and then you kind of talked also about social. There's also like the social model where we're fixing society or changing society to decrease the barriers that people with disabilities face. So I was wondering, someone who studies history of medicine and disability at the intersection of those two, how understandings of the social model of disability have affected the way you look at object histories and how you study this topic.
Okay, that's a very important question. So how do we balance the history of objects by looking at both the medical and the social history, especially if you're interested in medicine or like rehabilitation sciences or healthcare sciences? The challenge is always to look at what the devices are made for. So let's take hearing aids, for example. We know hearing aids are used for people who are hearing impaired or deaf to give them sound, to allow them to participate. But digital hearing aids, on the other hand, is something of, again, another one of those fluid devices because they're engineered to increase sound, but for some people they don't work in the sense that they don't allow them to do for them what's considered normal. So I'll give you an example. For most of my life, I wore analog hearing aids. Analog hearing aids make things loud. That's all they do. But they also had a little telecoil in them that allowed me to listen on the telephone, which is great. Like I can't hear on the telephone otherwise if it wasn't for these hearing aids. Now, in the early 2000s, when digital technology started to overtake the market, everything was digital. We started calling ourselves the digital age, and everything is being forced to the new digital technology. My audiologist told me that analog hearing is out of touch. They're like VCRs. Nobody makes them anymore. There's no repair people for them anymore. And I had no choice but to convert to digital hearing aids. The thing with the new digital hearing aids is that it wasn't an easy process of just wearing them and then suddenly I'm in the digital age, so to speak. I hear better. For about a year and a half, I had severe migraine, as my brain literally rewired itself to hear a different type of sound. The digital hearing aids are no longer compatible with the telephone anymore. They cannot hear on phone anymore. I could hear very clearly the person sitting next to me, but I cannot hear a lecture room. Or sometimes vice versa. I can hear somebody in the classroom next door, but I cannot hear a student sitting in front of me. So how is it beneficial to me? And one really weird thing, when they were trying to sell me the hearing aids, they told me that I could choose one that had Wi-Fi capabilities. It's like, I have enough Wi-Fi technology in my backpack. I don't need them in my ear. So this is a confusion about who this benefits. Under the medical model, this is the medical technology that allowed me to hear. Under the social model, it failed because it still creates more barriers for me, right? So this is just one example, but some of the things that I've looked at also in trying to bring an impairment and rethinking it in a social model. So someone who is blind, for example, we don't need to always think about a white cane or glasses. We can look at the art that blind people make. The adjustments they make in the home, where they move things, so they're more familiar with the spaces. So these are just off the top of my head some examples, but that's a very important question, and that is a conversation we always need to have when we're thinking about disabilities and technology. Okay, thank you. Yes, I have to come around. Just give me a few seconds. Yes, hi.
Self-perception, both with disability and hearing aid, obviously changed with technology, but also with time. And I'm curious, sort of the intersection in the way that we talk about disability with age, as that sort of changes since she was sort of grown with and sort of lifelong sort of like user of this hearing aid, but how that perhaps both the social conceptions of disability as you age, having those be changing forces, and also her own self-identity, where those sorts of intersections. Perhaps in her art or in her memoirs, if that was sort of, if she talked a little bit more, maybe the greater acceptance of something like a hearing aid with age. I'm not sure if that's.
No, that's a great question. Like, age is a very important part of this conversation. You're right. Brett did feel more assertive about her identity as a deaf person the older she grew. There are several factors for that. One can be that she felt more comfortable living in New Mexico, where she was popular as an artist and well known for being a friend of artists. I mean, artists and writers went there just to see her, interview her. They want to hear her story. They want to hear her experience. She was celebrated much more than she was ridiculed when she was younger. So that's part of some of these changes. The other argument can be that hearing loss is more visible in elderly people, right? Like it's seen as the normal part of aging. So as you age, she will no longer she was just an elderly woman who was deaf and then started to go blind. She was not this deaf young person trying to make her mark on the world. And that is her own self-perception. And that did change a lot. As I said, like, you see herself becoming more and more assertive the older that she got. Whereas when she was younger, she just was much more conflicted. And then just this cultural change, as the older we get, the wiser we become. Right? And then we stop caring about all these things that bothered us in our youth. So, okay. Yeah.
I wonder if we could just talk about it. It's sort of been a thread, although maybe not explicit all the time, the notion of stigma associated with prosthetic use. Can you talk about how stigma sort of contributes to our understandings of prosthetics?
The stigma is a very important concept when we think about disability. So one thing I've looked at various objects of disability is how they always tend to be hidden. And what happens when they're not designed to be hidden. So take the case of Andrew Garley's prosthetic arm. If he had accepted the hospital gave him prosthetic, which was basically just kind of like hands, wooden hands, painted pink. They didn't allow them to grip, or they could allow them to grip only if you had one functional hand, because you just put things under the hand. But for him, that was not useful. So he designed something that looks quite scary, but it was functional for him. And then he separated himself from the stigma because he had to work. He was 16 when he lost his arm, so he had to work. His father was blind, so he was the breadwinner of the family. But a lot of adjustments that I've seen, interestingly enough, are about battling the stigma by self-affirming these objects. So painting a prosthetic like blue, painting the ear trumpet, almost as a way to own up this ridicule or neglect or rejection from society as a whole. But most of them strictly medicalized objects, they're designed to be concealed and hidden because they're adopting to the greater cultural stigma. Yeah.
Would you say, though, that in the last I would say at least 5 years, there's been a really big push just in mainstream media, but also just overall society to be much more accepting of people with disabilities? Like, there's so much more of a push to make things more accessible, even with technology, or, we all have to do this adaptationally in Ontario. I don't know if you were still here when we had that, but the Ontario Disabilities Act, where everything has to be compliant by a certain year, and there's a movement where people who use wheelchairs, and there's a big media campaign saying, if you can't stand up, then stand out. So to decorate your wheelchair with vibrant colors and sort of like painting your leg blue, and it seems to me that there's much more acceptance and a push for rights for people with disabilities than 10 years ago. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure. In a way, yes and no. Okay, there has been a trend toward more acceptability over the last 5 to 10 years, I would say, making things more accessible. But at the same time, the stigma and the barriers are still very much persistent. Now, I wanted to think, for example, wheelchair users in space. So when a building says that it is wheelchair friendly and accessible, it does not always mean that it is wheelchair accessible and friendly the same way it would take an able-bodied person to enter a building. So if I enter a building, open the door, it takes me 2 minutes to go from the bottom of the stairs to the top and enter the building and go to the classroom. Let's suppose. Let's suppose the building also has a ramp and an elevator. But to access the ramp will take you around and go to the back of the building, the elevator, and then it takes you 10 minutes to get to the same classroom. That's not the same level of accessibility. Accessibility doesn't always mean access. It means also putting in the same wavelength as for able-bodied person. Then we've seen the greater recognition for acknowledging people's diverse experiences with disability. Like, not all wheelchair users are the same. Not all disabled people are the same. But then we cast an able-bodied person to play a wheelchair user in a movie. So these are the kind of things that occur. We have better, more powerful hearing aids, but then we advertise them only for elderly people. So No, they all these kind of complex there. Like just because the technology has improved, just because our conversations about accessibility and disabilities have changed, does not also mean that these have been shared in the broader societal community. There is, there's many examples, but you're right. Like, yes, we have been talking about it more. They have been pushed for it more, but disabled activists and designers are often left out of the conversation in many ways. So, and I think that is the problem. Like, you can't just pat yourself in the back for thinking about something being more accessible without also including the users themselves who will be impacted with this. Okay.
So I wonder if you could talk about this lady that is this Dorothy Brett figure. She's very elite.
Mm-hmm.
She's from a very elite background, and her access to technology is based on her individual finances.
Mm-hmm.
So when do nation states say it is the duty of the state to provide people who cannot hear with prosthetics?
Mm-hmm.
When is because these examples are all people who are helping themselves, or they get a prosthetic that's bad, or nothing. So when is there an idea that it's the duty of the state to provide?
That's a very important question. And a lot of that falls under accessibility services provided by the government. So in the United States, they have the American with Disabilities Act. And a lot of insurance companies work with that act to define what they mean by giving someone provision. So for example, cochlear implants are covered for children. So insurance companies cover cochlear implants, but not over the age of 18.
Can you explain? Not everyone maybe knows what
Oh,
cochlear implant
okay,
is.
cochlear implant are type of hearing device where you put it in your brain. So it's like surgically implanted in your brain, and you use magnets to hear sound. So the sounds are not transmitted to the ear, but they're made in your brain. So there's a new version of them called auditory brainstem implant, where the implants are put in your base of your brain. So it allows you to hear by bypassing the damaged parts of your ear anatomy. So cochlear implants have often been perceived as a cure for deafness as soon as they were fixed. As soon as they were introduced. A technological fix as early as the 1990s. But the problem with that is that it has to be implemented in children under the age of 5. So then they'll pick up language, they'll pick up sound, and they can go up learning how to adjust to different sounds. But they're very, very expensive. Not just the technology itself, but the surgery, the anesthesia, and all of the things that happen in hospital settings. And for a lot of Americans, out of the reach, unless you are wealthy and leading, you have great private insurance that covers it. In Canada, in Ontario at least, I know there was some provision for cochlear implant. But I want to go back to the question more broadly about what's the state's responsibility to provide these technological devices to people who need them. By thinking about Britain, Natural Health Service. So Britain developed universal health care in the 1940s, and one of the things they did when they first introduced the health care was to insert eyeglasses and hearing aids were available. They only had one hearing aid model, and they believed that everybody who was hearing impaired or deaf would benefit from this one hearing aid model, which was not true. Not everybody would benefit from these models, just like not everybody would benefit from one particular style of eyeglasses. So people go back to like photographs of 1940 and you wonder why everybody kind of has the same type of eyeglasses when you look at photographs of British people, because they were free and they had to choose from like 5 different models that fit their face. So this idea that we can create a standardized product and then give it to everybody who needs it often fail, which relies on people going elsewhere to buy them or making their own adjustments. But my personal belief is that the government of the state should have responsibility to provide some kind of asset, whether it's to healthcare services with prosthetics or implants or hearing aid or glasses, as the way to rethink these devices as health goods rather than as health goods.
Health goods.
Yes. Okay, so they are health products that make their life better, more bearable, the same way like taking vitamins every day would. So that's the way I see it. Not the way insurance companies see it, but yeah, okay. Yeah. Yes.
As a student, I do my PhD in human design. The information that you provided was, I can see that it speaks about research, especially to do analysis of these documents in the past. And the work that I do right now is I work with people with disabilities and make it multi-form research. With your story of Dorothy Brett, how do you manage to stay true to her story, knowing that you can't really like go back or things like that?
So can you repeat the question?
So the question is, how do you manage to do research on more artifacts or secondary analysis to stay true to their stories?
Okay, so how artifacts tell me more stories? Well, one thing I look at is where do I find these artifacts? So some of the collections are in museums, museum like Rockville Museum, the Voluntary Museum, the Canadian Science Museum. Some of them are actually found in smaller collections, like some rehabilitation services, they have their own small collection of artifacts that they've used when they were giving services to patrons or patrons have made when they're here. Looking at them, where they're originally housed, also give me an understanding of how to push that history and where the history takes me. So a painting of an ear trumpet took me in this direction I never thought I was going to go. And this project had just spearheaded from there. But when I approach any kind of object, disability, I try to avoid limiting myself into its present existence. So this is, for example, a cane that somebody used in 1880. Okay? It's a boring cane, it's wood. It doesn't tell me anything more than the fact that they were the user that used the cane. Why do we still have this cane? Why is it still here all these years later? And why did the creator decide to keep it? Or why did somebody donate it? What's significant about this cane? Sometimes I'm looking at archives that sometimes just catalog description. Follow up on that. Again, it takes me to the wonderland that I never thought I would go. And just falling down that rabbit hole. And there's a lot of ways to approach that. And I always encourage my own students, because I teach a class on disability and technology, is when they pick an artifact to write the final essay from, try not to limit themselves in the scope. So look at an object, you know the basics, you know what it's made of, you know what date it's from, maybe you know the user. Where did it come from? One student who wrote a paper on a Utica crib. So Utica crib is a wooden crib about this big, and was used at psychiatric institutions to restrain patrons, okay, when they were misbehaving or when they wanted to punish them. It's awful. It's like a coffin, basically. And there's no room to move, and then you kind of have to sit like confined like this. And a student went to the London Museum in Ontario to look at it, and open it up, and there's claw marks with blood stains on it. And then started looking more into the history of this Utica crib and found out it was actually from a psychiatric institute in Toronto, where the doctor, the psychiatrist, was under investigation for abuse. And then somehow ended up getting donated, first to Kingston, then to London. So, and it told her a lot about how these cribs were used in practice. But it was just looking at one thing in a museum and just going off from there. I think we can learn so much by just taking the time to think about where these objects fit into broader history. And like I said, looking at intersectional history. So from Brett, I learned about the British aristocrats. I learned about post-impressionist paintings and painters and writers like I've never thought of before. I learned also about the life of Native Americans in New Mexico, because she engaged a lot with them. And the one who lived near her ranch did interact a lot with them, and she learned about their life and captured it in painting. I also learned it was very rare for a white person to get an invitation to one of these ceremonies. So the fact that she did also tell us something about the relationship she formed from them. Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah.
Just going back to the question that Dr. Spencer asked about how much the state has a responsibility to provide particular objects or particular aids for individuals with disabilities. I was wondering, when we think about Brett, she seemed to use painting as almost as much. You said that she finds peace in her disability through painting, and so it seems like painting almost as much of a way
live with her disability as maybe her ear trumpet or any other any of her other aids might have been. So I was wondering if you think that we should be expanding the definition of what medical instruments are, or what the state should be providing for, which kinds of.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's a great question. Yes, Brett did turn to painting as a way to deal with her trauma and her pain in being a deaf person. I haven't seen the entirety of her painting because some of them are in private collections, so there's gaps in the years, so to speak. There's some years when she painted so much, and there's others when just only a few paintings. But if I line up the painting and look at what I know is happening in her life, yes, I can see changes in personality, changing in substance. But going back to what you said about changing definition of how we think about, I guess, treating or dealing with disabilities, I want you to recall just, what was it, a few months ago, where there was a change in a law in Ontario, where allow doctors can prescribe going to museums as a way to deal with mental health. So that was fantastic. Like, really rethinking about what we mean in terms of medicine and health and how we deal with these kinds of emotional stresses or disabilities, that a prescription is no longer just about prescribing therapy or prescribing a drug, but actually going and engaging with color and objects and artifacts. Yeah. So people are already thinking about that, and there are already changes happening at the legislative level as well. Not just in Ontario, I don't know where else. No. Okay.
If there's no more questions, then I'd like to invite everybody to speak informally with Dr. Verdi. Eat all the cookies because I cannot take them home, and join me in thanking her for coming today.
Thank you.